This story is titled, My Parents Threw Me Out at 18 with Nothing. Now they're homeless, begging for help. But I shut them off. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Hey Reddit. I never thought I'd be the type of person to share my personal life on here, but I'm at a breaking point, and I need to get this off my chest. I still remember the day it happened. I was 18, technically an adult, but not really. I didn't have a clue what I was doing with my life. Graduation had just passed, and I figured I had the summer to figure things out. Maybe start looking for a part-time job or enroll in community college. Like, normal stuff. My parents had other plans. It started out like any other day. I woke up late, lounged around in my pajamas, and watched TV. My dad worked in construction, so he was always up early and home by dinner. My mom, she didn't work. She was one of those people who spent her days cleaning obsessively and looking perfect for no reason. It wasn't like we were rich or anything, but my dad did okay, and they were always strict about money. Anyway, around 5 p.m., my mom called me into the kitchen. I figured she just wanted me to do some chore I hadn't done yet. When I walked in, I saw both of them sitting there, waiting. My dad's arms were crossed, and my mom had this weird look on her face. I immediately felt uneasy. Sit down, my dad said. I sat. It was like I was being called into the principal's office. He leaned back in his chair, like he was settling in for a conversation he'd rehearsed in his head. So, you're 18 now, he said. I blinked. Yeah. He nodded, like he was confirming something. Well, you're an adult now, and adults need to learn to stand on their own 2 feet. What? I was genuinely confused. My mom jumped in. We've provided for you for 18 years. That's more than enough. It's time for you to figure things out on your own. I just stared at her. Like, what the hell is happening right now? You're kicking me out? I finally asked, my voice cracking a little. My dad shrugged. It's called responsibility. You're old enough to take care of yourself. Now, let me tell you something about my parents. They weren't abusive. Like, they didn't hit me or anything. But they were cold. They were strict, controlling, and treated everything like a transaction. My dad would constantly complain about how expensive I was, like I was some debt he couldn't wait to get rid of. My mom, on the other hand, always made me feel like a chore, something she just had to deal with. I wasn't a kid to them. I was an obligation. I tried to stay calm, but I don't have a job yet. I just graduated. That's your problem, my dad said. My problem? I repeated, feeling the lump in my throat get bigger. How am I supposed to pay for rent? Or college? You'll figure it out, my dad said, completely unfazed. We had to do it, and so will you. I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream at them, but I was so caught off guard that I just sat there, staring at them. My mom kept her expression blank, like this was the most logical thing in the world. She even tried to make it sound nice by adding, We're doing this because we love you. You need to learn to be independent. Love? Are you kidding me? That didn't feel like love. It felt like abandonment wrapped in some weird justification. I tried reasoning with them. Can I just stay until I find a job? I can help with rent. No, my dad said firmly. You have a month to pack your things and leave. That was it. No discussion, no compromise. Just get out. I spent the rest of that night locked in my room. I didn't cry, I was too shocked for that. I just sat on my bed, staring at the wall. The house I'd lived in my whole life suddenly didn't feel like home anymore. My parents were in the living room, probably watching TV like nothing had happened. How do you throw your kid out like that and go on with your evening like it's normal? I spent the next few weeks scrambling. I had a part-time job at a grocery store, but it barely paid anything. I picked up as many shifts as I could, working late nights and weekends. I applied for loans, but I didn't have much credit history, so the interest rates were brutal. I looked for apartments and quickly realized that everything in my budget was absolute garbage. Eventually, I found a tiny studio on the edge of town. The building was falling apart, the neighbors were loud, and the whole place smelled like mildew. But it was cheap, and that's all I cared about. I signed the lease a week before my deadline and started packing my stuff. The day I moved out, my parents didn't help me. They didn't even say goodbye. My dad sat on the porch, watching me carry box after box to my friend's beat-up car. My mom didn't come out of the house at all. I'll never forget that moment. My dad didn't even look at me when I left. He just sipped his beer and said, Good luck. Good luck? Are you serious? When I moved into that tiny, run-down studio apartment at 18, it felt like the bottom. I had nothing. No furniture, barely any money, and no idea how I was going to make it. That first year was survival mode, plain and simple. I was working part-time at a grocery store, but that wasn't nearly enough to cover rent, food, and bills. I picked up every shift I could. Weekends, holidays, overnights, whatever they'd give me. My manager was a hard ass who didn't like me much, but he couldn't deny I was reliable. If someone called out, I was there. The apartment itself was a dump. I wish I was exaggerating. The walls were cracked, the windows let in more cold air than they kept out, and the shower had one setting: ice cold or scalding hot. My neighbor on the left liked to blast heavy metal at 2 a.m., and my neighbor on the right smoked so much weed, the smell seeped into my walls. I got used to it. You kind of have to. Furniture wasn't in the budget. I slept on a blanket on the floor for almost 2 months before I found someone selling a ratty old futon for $10 on Craigslist. It smelled weird, but I didn't care. It was better than the floor. For a table, I used an upside-down milk crate, and my dresser was a stack of boxes I'd taken from the grocery store stockroom. I got really good at living cheap. Food was ramen, rice, eggs, and whatever was on sale. I learned tricks like how to make instant noodles seem like an actual meal by adding frozen veggies and soy sauce. My monthly entertainment was streaming free stuff on my laptop. When I wasn't working, I was trying to figure out how to get into school. My dream had always been tech. I loved computers, even as a kid, but college was expensive, and I didn't have anyone to help me. I didn't qualify for many scholarships, and the loans I got came with interest rates that made my stomach hurt. Still, I knew I couldn't keep working minimum wage jobs forever, so I signed up for classes at the local community college. I could only afford part-time, which meant I'd be taking longer to finish, but I figured it was better than nothing. Balancing work and school was brutal. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. to open the store, work an 8-hour shift, then head straight to campus for night classes. I'd get home around 10 p.m., dead on my feet, and still have to study for a test or finish an assignment. Some nights, I'd just fall asleep sitting up with my laptop still open. I was constantly tired, constantly stressed, and constantly broke. But no matter how bad it got, I didn't quit. I remember one night, about a year in, I was sitting on the futon with my textbooks spread out around me, trying to study. It was freezing in the apartment because the heating barely worked, and I didn't have money for a space heater. I was wrapped in 2 hoodies and a blanket, shivering, and I just started laughing. Like, full-on laughing at how ridiculous my life had become. I think part of me was losing it a little. I thought about calling my parents. I don't know why. Maybe I was hoping they'd changed or felt guilty. But every time the thought crossed my mind, I remembered that night at the kitchen table, the way they had looked at me like I was just a problem they were solving. That memory killed any urge to reach out. They didn't care, and I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing me fail. Over time, things got a little better. I picked up a second job on weekends doing deliveries, and that helped cover some of my bills. I was still stretched thin, but I could finally buy things like a real bed. I'll never forget the day I brought home that mattress. I didn't even have a bed frame yet, but I didn't care. Just having a proper place to sleep felt like winning the lottery. By the time I was 21, I had finished my associate's degree. It took longer than most people, but I did it. I was proud of myself, but I also knew I couldn't stop there. Community college got me started, but to get a decent job in tech, I needed a bachelor's degree. I transferred to a state university. It wasn't fancy, and I commuted from my crappy apartment to save money, but I didn't care. I kept working 2 jobs to make it work. Most days, I felt like I was running on fumes. I'd drive to class with half an hour of sleep, chugging the cheapest gas station coffee I could find. During those years, I started cutting out a lot of the people I knew from high school. Not because I didn't like them, but because our lives were so different. They were going on vacations, getting help from their parents, and partying on weekends. I couldn't relate to any of that. My weekends were spent delivering pizzas or cleaning up stockrooms. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel bitter sometimes. I envied people whose parents actually wanted to help them. I envied people who could focus on school without working 2 jobs just to survive. But that bitterness was also what kept me going. I had something to prove, not just to my parents, but to myself. By 24, I graduated with my bachelor's degree. I still remember the day I got the email saying I'd landed my first real job, a junior position at a tech company. I just sat there staring at my laptop, stunned. It was the first time in years I felt like things were finally going to be okay. That first paycheck felt surreal. I didn't have to worry about whether I could afford groceries anymore. I didn't have to choose between paying rent or fixing my car. I even started saving money for the first time in my life. A year later, I moved out of that awful apartment into something better. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, quiet, and felt like home. I bought furniture, a real bed, a couch, a table. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was just surviving. I was actually living. By 26, I bought my first house. It wasn't big, just a modest two-bedroom, but it was mine. Walking through that door the first time, I felt like I'd won. I'd done it. I built this life from nothing, without anyone's help. My parents didn't know any of this. I didn't want them to. As far as I was concerned, they were just part of my past. I didn't hate them, but I didn't think about them much either. They made their choice when they threw me out. I made mine when I decided to succeed anyway. For years, I didn't hear a word from my parents. No texts, no calls, no updates from anyone except the occasional comment from my aunt. It was like they vanished from my life the minute I walked out their front door. And honestly, that was fine by me. By the time I was 28, I'd settled into my life pretty comfortably. I wasn't rich or anything, but I had a stable job in tech, money in the bank, and my house. A small, cozy two-bedroom I'd bought with years of saving. I'd been promoted once at work and was aiming for another step up. Life felt stable, which was something I'd never really known before. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from my aunt. It was weird because we only talked occasionally, usually around the holidays when she'd check in to see how I was doing. This time, though, her voice sounded different, like she was bracing herself. "I thought you should know," she started. "Your parents lost the house." At first, I didn't say anything. I was caught completely off guard. "What do you mean they lost the house?" I finally asked. She sighed. "Your dad got involved in some bad business deal. From what I understand, he thought he could make a quick profit, but it backfired. Big time. He got sued and, well, they took everything. The house, the cars, their savings, gone." I sat back in my chair, letting it sink in. My dad had always been obsessed with money. I can't tell you how many times he'd lecture me growing up about saving, about being responsible, about how people who waste money deserve to lose everything. And now he'd managed to lose everything. "What are they doing now?" I asked. "They've been staying with some friends for the past couple of weeks," she said carefully, like she was waiting for my reaction. "But it's not a long-term situation. They don't have anywhere to go." I could already feel where this was heading. "They're going to need help, and I thought maybe you—" I cut her off with a short laugh. "Me? Why would I help them?" "They're still your parents," she said quietly. I felt my chest tighten. "Still your parents." It was the same line I'd heard 1,000 times when I told people about how they threw me out. Like the word parents erased everything they'd done to me. "They didn't care when I needed help," I said flatly. "They made their choice." My aunt didn't argue. I think she knew better than to try. After a pause, she just sighed. "I just thought you should know." I hung up, shook my head, and tried to move on with my day. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't feel sorry for them, not even close. But I felt something. It wasn't anger anymore. That had burned out years ago. It was more like a strange curiosity. These were the people who had told me to figure it out when I was 18. Now it was their turn, and they had no idea how to do it. A few weeks went by, and I didn't hear anything else about them. I figured they were still hopping between friends' couches or trying to come up with some other half-baked plan. Then, one Saturday morning, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I live in a quiet neighborhood, so knocks are rare. I opened the door and froze. It was my parents. My dad looked rough. He used to be a big, imposing guy, always standing tall, always in charge. Now he looked smaller, like life had literally worn him down. His face was lined, his clothes were wrinkled, and he had bags under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. My mom, who always used to take so much pride in looking perfect, her hair, her clothes, her makeup, looked disheveled, her face pale and drawn. For a moment, I just stared at them. I don't think I'd seen them in over 10 years. "We need to talk," my dad said, his voice low and strained. I didn't say anything. I just crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. My mom jumped in, her voice shaking. "We lost the house. We don't have anywhere to go." I tilted my head slightly, playing dumb. "Yeah?" I heard. My dad shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing at my mom like he wanted her to say the next part. She did. "We thought maybe we could stay here," she said quickly. Like if she said it fast enough, I wouldn't notice how insane it was. "Just for a little while, until we get back on our feet." I couldn't help it. I laughed. It wasn't even a bitter laugh this time. It was genuine disbelief. "You're joking, right?" I said. My dad's face tightened. He wasn't used to being on this side of the conversation, asking for help instead of giving orders. "We don't have anyone else to turn to," he said, his voice growing tense. Oh, and I'm supposed to care now? I shot back. We're your parents, he snapped. You owe us. The entitlement in his voice was staggering. He said it like it was a fact, like it was some universal rule of life that I owed them, simply because they were my parents. You're serious? I asked, shaking my head. You threw me out at 18 with nothing. You didn't care if I starved or ended up homeless. Now you're here because what? You expect me to save you? We didn't have a choice, my mom cried, her voice breaking. Neither did I said, feeling the years of anger bubbling to the surface. I didn't have a choice when you shoved me out the door. I had to figure it out on my own, and I did. So what makes you think you get to walk into my life now and ask for help? My mom's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel guilty. Not even a little. Please, she said quietly. We don't have anywhere else. I stared at them for a moment, trying to decide if I felt even an ounce of sympathy. I didn't. If anything, seeing them like this just solidified how right I'd been to cut them off all those years ago. You should have thought about that before you threw me out, I said finally. I'm not your backup plan. My dad's face turned red, and for a second, I thought he was going to start yelling. But he didn't. He just clenched his jaw and glared at me. My mom looked down, wiping at her eyes. Good luck, I said flatly, and then I closed the door in their faces. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. I expected to feel something, regret, guilt, anything, but I didn't. All I felt was calm. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. I went back to my kitchen, finished my coffee, and went on with my day. I didn't expect them to come back. After I shut the door in their faces, I thought they'd get the message. But apparently, some people can't take no for an answer. The next morning, I woke up to several missed calls. I didn't even need to check the caller ID to know who they were from. My phone buzzed again while I was brushing my teeth. Another call. I let it go to voicemail. By noon, the calls stopped, but then the text started. First, it was my mom. Please, we don't have anywhere to go. Just for a few weeks. We'll be out of your hair. Then my dad. We're still your parents. You can't just leave us out here. I didn't respond to either of them. I wasn't interested in having this argument. They were adults, just like I had been at 18 when they decided I needed to figure things out. It was their turn now. But they didn't stop. A few hours later, my aunt called. I ignored it at first, but then I got curious about what she'd say and picked up when she called again. I don't want to get in the middle of this, she started, which immediately told me that she was getting in the middle of it. Then don't, I said flatly. She sighed. They showed up at my place this morning. They told me what happened. They've been couch hopping for weeks, haven't they? I asked. I wasn't surprised. My aunt had a soft spot for people in trouble. Yes, she admitted, but it's getting harder for them to find places to stay. They asked if I could call you and I... Aunt Laura, no, I interrupted. I'm not helping them. They're your parents, she said quietly, like that phrase was supposed to work some kind of magic. I don't care, I shot back. They didn't care about me when I needed them. They made it perfectly clear that I was on my own, so now they're on their own. That's fair. She sighed again, but this time it was different. I could hear the resignation in her voice. I get it, I really do. But you know how stubborn they are. They're not going to stop. Well, they're going to have to, I replied. I'll block their numbers if I need to. I didn't have to wait long before things escalated. The next morning, Sunday, there was another knock at my door. I knew exactly who it was before I even opened it. This time, I didn't bother with pleasantries. I swung the door open, arms crossed, and stared at them. What part of no are you not understanding? I asked bluntly. My mom looked like she'd been crying all night. My dad, on the other hand, looked pissed. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched at his sides, like he was barely holding himself together. We just want to talk, he said, his voice low and strained. We already talked, I said. You asked to move in. I said no. What else is there to say? My mom's voice cracked. Please, just listen to us. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside and shut the door behind me. I didn't want them standing in my entryway, and I sure as hell wasn't inviting them in. Fine, I said. Talk. My mom started first. She told me how they'd been staying with friends, how those friends were starting to lose patience, and how they couldn't get back on their feet without help. My dad chimed in occasionally, but his words were sharp and defensive. We're not asking for a handout, he said. Just a place to stay for a little while. We'll pay rent. We'll help out. I let them finish before I spoke. Do you remember what you told me when you kicked me out at 18? Neither of them said anything. I pressed on. You said I was an adult. You said it was time for me to figure things out. You didn't care that I didn't have a job or a plan or anywhere to go. You threw me out anyway, and I had to figure it out. So now it's your turn. That's not fair. my mom whispered, tears streaming down her face. Not fair? I repeated, raising my voice. You're right. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair when I was 18, sleeping on the floor of a crappy apartment, eating instant noodles because I couldn't afford real food. It wasn't fair when I was working 2 jobs just to survive. But you didn't care about fair then. So why should I care about it now? My dad's face turned red. We did what we thought was best for you, he snapped. We taught you how to be independent. You didn't teach me anything, I shot back. You abandoned me. You kicked me out because I was a burden. Don't stand here and try to act like you did me some kind of favor. For a moment, no one said anything. My mom just stood there, crying quietly, while my dad looked like he was trying to figure out what to say. Finally, he spoke. We're your family, he said. You owe us. That was the last straw. I took a step closer to him, lowering my voice. I don't owe you anything. I got here on my own. No thanks to you. And now you want to come into my life and act like I owe you? That's not going to happen. You ungrateful little... My dad started, but I cut him off. Ungrateful? I laughed bitterly. You know what? I am grateful. I'm grateful that you kicked me out because it showed me exactly who you are. It showed me that I can't rely on anyone but myself. So thanks for that lesson. My mom wiped at her eyes, trying one last time. Please, we don't have anyone else. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to feel something, anything. But all I felt was empty. I had spent years struggling because of the choices they made. They didn't care when it was me on the edge of homelessness. So why should I care now? You made your choices, I said quietly. Now you get to live with them. With that, I turned around and walked back inside, shutting the door behind me. I locked it and stood there for a moment, just listening. I heard my mom sobbing softly and my dad muttering under his breath. After a minute, I heard their footsteps retreat. They were gone. That night, I sat on my couch with a beer in my hand, staring at the wall. I thought I'd feel relieved, triumphant even, but all I felt was tired. Not guilty, not sad, just tired. Like this weight I'd been carrying for years had finally been set down. For the first time, I realized something. I didn't need their approval, their love, or their apologies. I had built a life without them, and I didn't owe them a damn thing. Update 1.0. After I shut the door on my parents that day, I figured that was it. I'd said my piece, and they'd finally get the message. I didn't expect them to disappear completely, but I assumed they'd move on to someone else. Maybe a distant cousin, an old friend, someone willing to pity them enough to help. I was wrong. About 3 days later, I got home from work to find an envelope sticking out of my mailbox. It wasn't like the usual junk mail or bills. This was a thick, official-looking letter. My name and address were typed on the front, but there was no return address. I grabbed it, curious, and carried it inside. I sat at the kitchen table, opened it, and felt my stomach drop as soon as I saw the words at the top of the first page. Legal notice. I skimmed the document quickly, my heart pounding harder with every word. It was from a lawyer. Their lawyer. My parents had actually gone to an attorney. I had to read it twice just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. The gist of the letter was this. My parents were claiming that I was legally obligated to provide for them now that they were elderly and without means. They referenced something about filial responsibility laws, which apparently exist in some states. It was a stretch, but they were trying to force my hand legally. I couldn't believe it. The sheer audacity of these people. They threw me out at 18 and left me to fend for myself without so much as a phone call, and now they were trying to guilt-trip me through a lawyer? It felt surreal. At first, I thought it was a bluff. I mean, there was no way they had a case, right? But the fact that they even tried made my blood boil. I'd heard of people using lawyers to sue for unpaid debts or child support, but I never thought I'd see a day where my own parents would try to drag me into a courtroom because I wouldn't let them crash at my house. I called up my lawyer, a guy I'd used once before when I bought my house, and explained the situation. He listened patiently, then told me to email him a copy of the letter. A few hours later, he called me back. Yeah, don't worry about this, he said. They're trying to scare you, but they don't have a leg to stand on. Filial responsibility laws are rare, and even where they exist, they're extremely limited. So they can't actually force me to support them? I asked. Not a chance, he replied. They'd have to prove that they're completely destitute and that you have the financial ability to support them, neither of which applies here. Plus, the fact that they abandoned you at 18, if this ever went to court, they'd get laughed out of the room. Hearing that calmed me down a bit. I wasn't afraid of a legal fight. I knew I was in the right, but I didn't want to deal with the stress of it. My lawyer drafted a formal response and sent it to their attorney, making it crystal clear that I was under no legal obligation to help them. He also added that if they continued to harass me, I'd consider pursuing a restraining order. That part wasn't my idea, but when he suggested it, I didn't argue. I didn't hear from them for a few days after the letter was sent, and I thought maybe it had worked. But then, my phone started blowing up again. This time, it wasn't just my parents. My aunt called, my cousin called, hell, even some random family members I hadn't spoken to in years decided to weigh in. Apparently, my parents had been telling everyone they knew that I was refusing to save them after they'd sacrificed so much for me. The worst part was, a few people actually took their side. My cousin Mark, who I barely know, texted me saying, "Dude, they're your parents. You can't just leave them homeless. That's cold." I wanted to throw my phone across the room. I typed back, "Where were they when I was eating ramen for 3 years straight? Where were they when I was working 2 jobs just to survive? If they didn't care about me then, why should I care now?" Mark didn't reply. I spent the next week ignoring calls and messages. I blocked my parents' numbers completely and muted anyone else who tried to talk some sense into me. I wasn't going to let them guilt trip me into helping. Not after everything they'd done. One night, I was sitting on my couch scrolling through my phone when I got an email from my mom. I'd forgotten to block her there too. The email was long, way too long. It was the same sob story I'd already heard, but written out in painstaking detail. How they'd fallen on hard times, how my dad's bad decision had ruined them, how they were sleeping in a friend's spare room with no end in sight. And then, at the very end of the email, came this line, period. "You might not believe it, but we always loved you. We did what we thought was best for you." I sat there staring at that sentence, feeling my chest tighten, not with guilt, but with anger. We did what we thought was best. That's what they always said. Like throwing me out with no warning, no support, and no plan was somehow an act of love. I wasn't going to let them rewrite history. I didn't respond to the email. I marked it as spam and moved on. A few days later, my lawyer called to let me know that their attorney had backed off completely. "They're done," he said. They probably realized they weren't going to win and didn't want to waste more money on legal fees. That was the end of it, or so I thought. The whole situation left a bad taste in my mouth. For the first time in years, I started thinking about my parents more often, about the way they treated me when I was younger, about how hard I had to work just to survive because of their choices. It's funny, they always acted like they were teaching me some big, important lesson when they kicked me out, but they never learned a damn thing themselves. My dad, especially. He always believed he was smarter than everyone else, better with money, more responsible. Now he had nothing. Karma doesn't always work the way we want it to, but this felt pretty close. Update 2. A few months went by after that, and I didn't hear a word. My aunt told me at one point that my parents had moved to a small rental apartment across town. Some friend of theirs had lent them the deposit money. Apparently, my dad was trying to find work again, though his reputation had taken a hit because of that lawsuit. My mom was cleaning houses to bring in a little cash. Hearing that didn't make me feel anything. I didn't wish them harm, but I didn't feel pity for them either. It was just information. My aunt must have been expecting me to react because she hesitated after she told me. "I'm just letting you know," she said carefully. "Not because I think you should do anything. I just thought you might want to hear it." I thanked her for telling me and changed the subject. One day, not long after that conversation, I got a small package in the mail. It didn't have a return address, but I knew who it was from as soon as I opened it. Inside was an old photo of me as a kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old. I was standing in front of the house I grew up in, grinning ear to ear, holding a brand new bike. I remembered that day. It was my birthday, and I'd begged for that bike for months. For a split second, I could almost hear my parents cheering me on as I wobbled around the driveway trying not to fall. Tucked behind the photo was a handwritten note. It was short, just a couple of sentences in my mom's messy handwriting. "We're sorry for everything. We hope you're doing well. We just wanted you to know that we're proud of you." That's it. No begging, no asking for money, no long-winded explanations. Just that. I stared at the note for a long time, turning the words over in my head. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was genuine, maybe it wasn't. It didn't change anything for me, but for the first time, I didn't feel angry when I thought about them. I didn't feel much of anything. I put the photo and note back in the envelope and tucked it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Not because I wanted to keep it exactly, but because I didn't know what else to do with it. These days, I don't think about my parents much. I'm still working in tech, saving up for my next house, and enjoying the life I built for myself. I've made peace with what happened. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right, but it made me who I am today. Sometimes people ask me if I regret shutting my parents out, if I feel guilty for not helping them when they needed it. The answer is no. They made their choices, and I made mine. I'm not a bad person for protecting my own peace. I worked too damn hard to get to where I am to let anyone take that from me. I hope my parents figure things out. I really do. But that's not my responsibility. It never was. For anyone who's been through something similar, know this. It's okay to say no. It's okay to put yourself first. You're not selfish for refusing to let people who hurt you back into your life. You deserve peace. You deserve happiness. And you don't owe anyone a damn thing.